naturalists and climate stewards to connect across the state on topics including natural history, ecology, climate change, and the intersection of pressing human and environmental issues. If you would like to see our past Cones events, we'll be adding a link to the chat where you can see the Cones archives. We're expecting quite a few folks today, so just a few bits of housekeeping to go over. This is a Zoom meeting, not a webinar, so please remember to mute your mic and turn off your video during the presentation portion so we don't have to worry about background distractions. If you are having any technical issues, please type them into the chat and we'll work with you to troubleshoot. We will have plenty of time for questions at the end of the presentation, but if you want to type your question into the chat at any time so you don't lose it in your memory, just type question at the beginning so that we can find it easily when we're doing the questions at the end. We are recording this presentation. It'll take some time to get up on our YouTube channel and in our Cones archives because we just go through and make sure that the closed captioning matches what we actually said. So expect that in a few weeks available on our Cones archives. And we don't have a date for it yet, but we do know our topic for next month, May's presentation, is eDNA or environmental DNA. And so it's how researchers take little samples of water or soil and use them to find all the DNA of all the plants and animals that live in an area. So it's kind of a new area of research, and we're very excited to have that coming up next. So next up, I'd just like to do land acknowledgement. This virtual presentation is taking place throughout the unceded territory of California, with also a presenter from Arizona. So California was home to nearly 200 tribal nations. I'm speaking to you from Nisenan land. We acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. We encourage you to learn about which tribal nations are indigenous to the area where you are now living. We'll add a link to the chat with more information so you can find your local tribe. And finally, I'd just like to do an introduction to our guest speaker today. We have Theresa Crimmins. She is an internationally recognized phenology researcher, director of the U.S. Phenology Network, an associate professor in the School of Natural Resources and the Environment at the University of Arizona. In her role with the network, Theresa supports an amazing team of individuals and works enthusiastically to support the growth and use of phenology data and resources curated by the U.S. National Phenology Network, involvement in Nature's Notebook, and a broad appreciation of phenology among scientists and non-scientists alike. Theresa has published over 70 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters in journals including Nature, Geophysical Research Letters, Global Change Biology, and Journal of Ecology. Her writing has appeared in Scientific American, The Hill, and the Arizona Daily Star. And she has had multiple radio and television appearances, including on National Public Radio and the Weather Channel. In 2022, she was recognized by the University of Arizona as a Woman of Impact. Theresa's TEDx talk, delivered in October of 2024 as a part of the Universities of Arizona's Desert Gems event, was selected as a TEDx Editor's Pick. And her book, Phenology, is currently available for purchase. And we're going to share some links to her TEDx talk and her book in the chat now. And so with that, I will stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to Theresa so we can get to what you're all here for today. Thanks so much, Theresa.
So much. Thank you so much for that really comprehensive and very generous introduction. I can't talk and do stuff at the same time, so let me do this first and then I'll talk. Okay, it's working, right?
Yep.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you again. So this is the danger of saying stuff without having evidence to back it up. that I have to make a slight correction that the TEDx people had told me that my talk was going to be an editor's pick, but then they walked that back and they just released it last week without any fanfare at all. So don't spread the word that it was chosen as an editor's pick because it isn't anymore. I don't know why that happened. Anyhow, I'm still very excited to talk to you about phenology and in all the ways, and I will do my best to stay on track because it's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, and I get so excited about all the signs of spring. So as Allie very generously pointed out, my book is now available, and I wanted to make sure that you were aware that if you are interested in purchasing it, you can get 20% off if you buy it directly through with Penguin Random House with this Read MIT 20 discount code. But it's not very expensive. It's $16 or $17 anyways. And it's not really shameless self-promotion here. I wanted to make you aware of this book because I wrote it for folks like you all. I wrote it mainly because prior to this, there really hadn't been a very comprehensive but accessible resource for kind of bringing all the information about what we know about phenology together in one resource. And so it's pretty short and small. It's just like a pocket guide, but with the intent that it would help anybody who is interested in learning more about the subject have a quick primer and kind of learn what, read about what we know about the topic. And so a lot of the content that I'll share now is drawn directly from that and from my research in compiling that. So I love so much hearing all of the signs of spring that you've been observing where you are. I have been doing the same. Here are some of the very recent signs of spring here at my house in southern Arizona. The days are definitely getting longer and the temperatures are starting to creep up. I can't believe it. It was 96 here last Tuesday, which is way too hot, way too early. Thankfully, we're back into the, I think, upper 60s today. So thank goodness for that. But as a consequence, we're starting to see an awful lot of responses in both plants and animals in our yard. We're starting to see the scorpions make their appearances again. My son, who's 16, loves to go out with the black light, and we went out a couple weeks ago and we found a whole lot in the neighborhood and in our yard. We've got cacti flowering. We've got this tree in the middle is a Chinese pistache in my front yard. And I only recently realized that's the only tree in my yard that actually has leaf buds that break. And so I get the joy of watching those. The leaf buds are what you're seeing at the tip of the branch there. And at the same time that the leaf buds are breaking, the flowers are also opening. And the flowers are now fully open on the whole tree. And the bees love this tree. So that's fun. And then we were just chatting right before, those of us that were on before you all joined, we were talking about citrus flowering. I'm sure that many of you are experiencing that lovely scent of citrus flowers. This is a snapshot of my little dwarf lime tree in my backyard, and it makes me so happy. I actually grew up in Michigan, and how I knew it was spring there was because we'd start to see those big piles of snow that were pushed up into the corners of the parking lots that were getting all, that start out lovely and white. They start to get rather crusty and kind of gray and rather icy and very unpleasant to climb on. It starts to shrink away, and you can see all the salt on the road. We also start to see little plants pushing up through the snow. The very earliest ones are the crocuses and the snowdrops, named obviously because they come up while it's still snow on the ground. And one of the things that I really remember, I worked at the Allegan State Game Area for a couple of summers, which is on the west side of the Lower Peninsula. And there's all these dogwoods in that forest there. And the dogwoods would open up their bracts actually, rather than those are not actually petals that you see that are the white, they look like flowers. But the bracts would appear, and that was one of the earlier signs of activity among the trees in the forest. And it would be misty like this and cool, and it just, I miss that. It was really, really lovely. In both of those situations or those descriptions of spring, you might notice that I described both activity in plants and animals, very noticeable changes in plants and animals, and also shifts in environmental conditions. And so that saying that you might have learned as a kid, April showers bring May flowers, are a really good actual encapsulation of this. And the reason why that works is it's both things. It's the April showers is that set of environmental conditions, and then the May flowers is the consequent biological response. And so the science of phenology is really encompassing all of that. It's when stuff is happening seasonally in plants and animals, as well as why. So the environmental conditions or abiotic conditions that drive that. And we have a couple of different reasons for why those things occur. One is more predictable than the other. The first is that the fact that our Earth is tilted and that we are revolving around the sun. And so you might remember from grade school learning that the reason why we experience seasons is because as the sun is revolving around as the Earth is revolving around the sun, because we're tilted, in certain months, the northern hemisphere is angled toward the sun, and that's when we're experiencing longer days and warmer temperatures. And in other months, we are kind of pointed away from the sun, and that is when the days are shorter and colder. And we're right in the middle right now. We just crossed the equinox and we're right about there. And so our days are just beginning to get longer. This is very predictable. This happens. These things happen on the same day of the year every year, and is the underlying reason why we experience seasons. But it's far more complicated than that. And I am not an atmospheric scientist, so I am not going to explain all this. But at a very high level, we have an atmosphere that surrounds our planet. And we have these large air masses. And because we are going around the sun and because the Earth is turning, and that's what leads to us having days, we have air masses that circulate in all these different ways and result in winds and weather patterns, things like the jet stream that emerge as a consequence. And those things both have predictable activity and kind of vary from one day to the next. And so that's why we have weather. And because weather varies a lot from one day to the next, and definitely from one year to the next, we see that consequence in when plants and animals are undergoing their seasonal shifts. And so sometimes we see things happening earlier and other times it's later. This spring in much of the country, it's been pretty cool compared to a lot of recent years. And so we've not had a whole lot of anomalously early activity among plants and animals. It's pretty average compared to recent decades this year. But last year and several of the most recent years, things were very warm, very early, and so we had very early activity in plants and animals. We have evidence that folks, humans going back tens of thousands of years, were not only keeping track of or not only observing that things varied from year to year and over the course of the year, but also that they actually documented it. And so these images are taken from cave paintings that are abundant in Europe and actually date back anywhere from 15,000 years ago to up to 40,000 years ago. And folks have been aware of these cave paintings for a long time, and they had noted that there's symbols on a lot of them, and they're consistent symbols, and they're circled in yellow on this image. And only recently have anthropologists determined that they think they can understand that actually is record keeping, documenting seasonal cycles, and in particular things like migration in animals that likely early humans relied upon as sources of food and shelter and for their very existence. And what they think these tick marks and these dots refer to are the moons. And the moons more or less align with our months. And so they were able to know and keep track of, once we've had so many moons, after the cold part of the year, we're likely to see things like bison reappearing or horses, or I forget what the exact animals are. I'm sorry for that, but it's really interesting that we have evidence going all the way back to as early as humans were keeping track of stuff. They were keeping track of basically phenology. There's a whole lot of other evidence coming out of other cultures that have been inhabiting the planet for a very long time, that are captured more in oral traditions that also give us very clear evidence that humans have been tracking this kind of information. Again, because it has been so important to, survival, basically, making sure that we have food, that folks had food when they need it, and could find shelter and could respond to the ebb and the flow of things over the course of the year. And so there's a lot of documentation of this, but there's also a lot of recognition that it's not necessarily information that is for the taking. And so I want to make sure that I credit the tribes correctly that for which this particular relationship comes. In the Pacific Northwest, some anthropologists working closely with tribes and First Nations have documented a whole lot of phenological relationships. And this particular example is that the bird that Western folks generally recognize as the Swainson's thrush is actually referred to as the salmonberry bird. And that is because it is singing when salmonberries, which are closely related to raspberries, are ripe. And so therefore, if you hear this bird singing, it is time to go harvest the salmonberries. And there are hundreds of examples of relationships like this that have been documented and shared and utilized by folks in different tribes in different parts of the world to know when different activities should be undertaken. And sometimes it's information that's relationships that are actually really critical because it indicates when it's time to go do something that's far afield. So for example, another example I was just reading about was that, again, out of the Pacific Northwest, the growth of particular plants, nettles, is directly indicative of growth in seaweed out in the bay. And I forget which bay it was, but this elder knew that once the nettles reached a particular length or height, it was time to now go travel to that part of their territory and go capture or harvest the seaweed because now it was long enough and worthwhile to harvest. So Indigenous communities have captured this information and documented it and shared it for many generations, and they've in some cases shared it very generously, sometimes to the point where this knowledge has gotten disconnected from its source. And so you may be familiar with some recommendations like this one, which is to plant corn when oak leaves are the size of a squirrel's ear. There are a lot of these kind of like gardening wisdom statements that if you go on gardening blogs, you'll find. A lot of times though, if you and I find them most frequently either being circulated by the Old Farmer's Almanac or Mother Earth News, or some of these just gardening blogs and those kind of sources. And it's almost frustrating to see that sometimes they're referred to even as wives' tales, and it almost feels degrading because it's undermining that the fact that this information is actually born of a very deep and very deep connection with the land and with the plants and animals that are residing there, and a real appreciation for the relationships that exist. And so I'm I guess I'm on a tear these days to quash reference to this kind of information as wives' tales because it's born of experimentation and real world trial and error. So around the globe, we've got lots of examples of data being collected or records being captured and documented for a really long time of when things have happened. And one of the earliest that we seem to be aware of at this point is that folks, and I believe this started with monks in Japan, have been keeping track of when the cherry trees are flowering. And I understand that this is because cherry flowering is so ephemeral. And so to celebrate it is to recognize and appreciate the very ephemeral nature of life and the beauty and how fleeting it can be. But there are these documents that date all the way back to about the 800s that indicate when the cherry trees flowered. And those data have been reconstructed and assembled into records where we can now see how much when the cherry trees flower in Japan, going all the way back to the 800s. And over that 1200-year record, we can see a couple of things. One thing, so on this graph, the years are across the x-axis, and then the months or when the flowering occurred is along the y-axis. And each dot represents when the cherry blossoms first began to open in that year. And the black line is a moving average, so it's kind of giving you a, on average, how are things going? And what we see is that over those many centuries, it did vary. We had periods where it was earlier. If it's earlier, it's lower on the graph. We had particular periods where flowering tended to be later. We see a lot of variability. And then we get to the start of the Industrial Revolution, when we started, a whole lot of burning of coal and pumping stuff into the atmosphere. And we see a pretty distinct pattern here of those trees flowering earlier and earlier and earlier. And this graph is now out of date because this ended in 2022. All of the most recent dots get clustered right down here as well, meaning that trees now flower much earlier than they ever did in our recorded past, the last 1,200 years. That lines up really neatly with temperature. This graph is showing global temperatures over that period since basically the start of the Industrial Revolution. And what we see on the y-axis here, these are anomalies. So what they did was they took the years 1951 through 1980 and took what was the average temperature of the globe in each of those 30 years and then just averaged it. And then we compare the annual global temperature in every previous year and every year since. And so if the bar is blue and pointing downward, it means that year was colder than that long-term average. And if the bar is orange and pointing upwards, it was warmer than that period. And it's kind of hard to deny that there's a pretty apparent pattern here that it was colder compared to that period prior to it, and it's been warmer ever since. And that lines up really clearly with greenhouse gases, the concentration of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. I pulled this one from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC report, because it was the longest record I could find. And so let me just draw your attention to the fact that the x-axis here is extremely long. If we look at the period that we were just talking about, it's just right here, because this is millions of years ago. And what this is a reconstruction of the atmosphere, the atmospheric carbon dioxide, or the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And I wanted to be able to show that this is true, that we have had a lot of variation in recent millennia, and a whole lot, and there have been periods when the carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere was higher than it was now, but it was at least 2 million years ago, and the planet was very, very different back then. Totally different. Humans only arrived on the planet about 300,000 years ago, which is like about here. And we started our industrial revolution of pumping our own CO2 into the air right about somewhere right in here. And you just see that black line just skyrocket since we started doing that. And so there is a lot of background things at play that are affecting our species on the planet and ourselves in a bunch of very direct ways. So when plants and animals are faced with very rapidly changing conditions, like what we are experiencing right now with this very rapid increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and other gases too, and the consequent dramatic increases in temperature and changes in weather patterns, species basically have three options. They can adapt, meaning change how they respond to those conditions. They can pack up and move and go somewhere else where the conditions are more suitable, or they can die and go extinct. Animals are a little more fortunate because they are the ones that are a bit more able to employ this response. Plants, less so, and especially long-lived plants. It gets a lot harder because the conditions are changing so rapidly. But shifting phenology, meaning undertaking activity earlier or later in the year, is one of the ways that species can respond, can adapt, and try to become okay and able to still live and undergo life cycle events and produce offspring for another generation under these new and novel conditions. And so scientists really started to recognize just in probably about the 1980s and 1990s that actually shifts in phenology, changes in when plants and animals are undergoing seasonal events, is one of the most visible ways we can see how plants and animals are responding to these rapidly changing conditions. And if there's a growing evidence every day, more information is coming in from all different species and all different corners of the globe all the time, that tell different stories about how things are changing because everybody's doing it in their own ways. If we take everything that we know and we try to bundle it up and come up with a single number, globally, it looks like since the 1980s, which is when I was a kid, we've seen things shift in the spring by an average of about 4 days. That doesn't really sound maybe like that much, but when we start to break it down and look at what it takes to have a global shift of that magnitude, it gets a little more interesting. So for example, and in a lot of cases, how we assess this, how we can assess change, is we have to find records of when people documented stuff happening in the past that we can compare the present time to, because in a lot of times folks didn't keep track of things in the past because they didn't think they were going to need to assess how things were changing. So we are actively unearthing historical records as we speak and using those records to compare with present day observations to be able to assess change. And new research is coming out just about every day that helps fill in the gaps. And so this particular measurement comes from a study where somebody discovered a whole lot of observations that were documented in academic institutions in the early 1800s, even prior to the Civil War. Folks were keeping track of when different trees on their academic institution properties were leafing out and flowering. And they were documented in these really cool annals that were dusty and shoved away on shelves. Somebody discovered them, was very excited, took the effort to digitize them, meaning type them into a computer, and then we compared them with observations on when the same species of trees were leafing out and flowering in the same area, and they all showed dramatic shifts. This is one of the most dramatic. Tulip tree, which is just gorgeous tree. I love these flowers so much. Is now flowering almost a month earlier than it did back in the early 1800s, so prior to the start of the Industrial Revolution. And that has implications for the plants that rely upon those flowers as a pollination resource and so many other things. Another quick example, kind of in the same vein, is that in Switzerland, they have some really long-term records. Same period of record, effectively. So since the early 1800s, they've seen horse chestnut tree now leafing out about 11 days earlier than it used to. So it's interesting that we have basically the same period, 2 different locations, and definitely 2 different amounts of shift. We also see very clear shifts in the activity of animals too. And I'm just going to give a few examples. There's a whole lot more in the book if you're interested in this. But things like this adder, which is a snake in Europe, it's now coming out from its under the ground burrow where it spends the winter about a month earlier than just since the 1980s, which is a very big shift for a much shorter period of time. And this is problematic for these creatures because it puts them, you probably remember from grade school, snakes are reptiles which are cold-blooded. And so if they come out because they think it's warm, then they need for it to stay warm so that they can keep moving and they can go find food sources. If it suddenly turns cold, like we do have now with very variable springtime weather, that definitely puts them at risk, not only for not being able to move and so being more vulnerable to predation, but also their ability to find food and eat, or just freezing. Frost risk is much increased for critters that are coming out of hibernation earlier than they used to. One of the things that I was really shocked by when I was doing research was how much marine and aquatic species have been impacted. I'm a terrestrial biologist. I look at plants all the time. I hadn't prior to this really paid much attention to how oceanic and even marine or aquatic species were being affected by climate change, but in fact they are as well. And that's primarily because the oceans are getting a lot warmer and the circulation patterns that are occurring in oceans is being affected dramatically. And one thing that just blew my mind when I was doing research for this book was that there actually are some really amazing long-term data sets collected in water environments too. And this one particular one comes out of Narragansett Bay, Rhode Island, where they have been taking censuses of the different species of fish present in the bay weekly since the 1950s. I wish I knew why they started doing this. I actually don't know. But holy smokes, are there ridiculous amounts of change. So there are summertime residents in the bay and there's wintertime residents, fish we're talking about. Some of those winter residents have shortened their stay now by 3 months or more. This little guy is the longhorn sculpin, now spends on average 118 days fewer in the bay than it did back in the 1950s. And that's not the only one. Ocean pout and red hake are these also winter residents that are now spending 90 days less time in the bay than they used to. And then on the other end, the fish that are summertime residents are spending anywhere from 30 to 80 days longer than they used to just 60, 70 years ago. So kind of mind-blowing, honestly. Birds are another taxonomic group where we see really dramatic changes. These measurements, these facts come from a single study out of the Midwest, where they looked at egg laying and breeding. And again, just massive shifts. This particular data set, they looked back from the 1850s, so almost 200 years ago to present. But a couple of birds now are laying their eggs 40 to 50 days earlier than they used to. We're also seeing pretty dramatic shifts in the arrival time of migrants, springtime, birds that are coming north for their breeding, and they're having to also speed up the rate at which they migrate further north. And there are definitely mismatches emerging now where upon arrival, these migratory birds are faced with fewer food sources, and on their migratory journey, northward, they're having to move faster to keep pace with the available food. And so overall, birds are kind of struggling and are probably faced with continued struggle going forward. We also are seeing not just shifts in the timing, but in cases, again, where we have good enough historical data that we can make comparisons, we also see the direct consequences of those shifts, in a lot of cases, taking the form of being either more or less abundant on the landscape. And so one of the best data sets that we have, and you may have heard of this before, was that our friend Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Civil Disobedience and lived out in the Walden shack that he built, also kept really good records of what was happening in the spring in terms of what was flowering and what birds he saw showing up and what insects were active. And researchers out of Boston University discovered those records a couple decades ago, were very excited, and have since continued to make parallel observations and have done tons of comparative research between what Henry David Thoreau reported and what they are seeing now. And one of the many things that they've documented is that compared to Thoreau's time, the species that haven't shifted their phenology very much are a lot less frequently observed on the landscape. And so St. John's wort is just one of those examples where back in Henry David Thoreau's time, it was a lot more abundant on the landscape. We see it a lot less now, and it looks like that's because it's pretty resistant, it's pretty stubborn, and it hasn't advanced the timing of its flowering anywhere near what some of its other neighbors are doing. And those other plants are actually becoming much more abundant in place. So why do we care? So what? Things are changing, things are happening earlier, things are happening later. Is that really going to impact our lives? Well, yeah, actually, there are a lot. There are abundant both ecological consequences for this, and then ways that we feel effects directly as humans, even in our everyday urban lives. One of the ways we see this is impacts to agriculture and to how much groceries cost and how available they are. One quick example of this is that a lot of our fruit trees require a particular amount of exposure to a particular amount of chill in the wintertime. And if they don't receive that sufficient chill, then once the trees are exposed to the springtime warmth, they fail to respond. They are still waiting for that chill to arrive, and so they don't follow through and open their flowers and get pollinated like they should, because they're like, hey, it's not spring yet. I haven't experienced enough winter yet. We had one of those kinds of years in 2017, which was a very early warm year in the whole eastern US. And as a consequence, the peach crop was devastated in Georgia. The trees just didn't respond. They didn't open their blooms. They didn't get pollinated, and we had an 80% loss of the peach crop that year. And this kind of situation is occurring with much more rapid frequency across the country and in other crops as well. Another way that we're experiencing it is in allergies. This is all depressing news, I'm sorry to say, especially if you suffer from allergies. Just since the 1990s, on average here in the US, our allergy season has lengthened by about 20 days. And because of the warmer temperatures and the higher concentrations of carbon dioxide in the air, we're basically feeding our plants that produce pollen the ingredients they need to pump out more pollen. And so we are seeing about 20% more pollen in the air than we did just a few decades ago. And even more concerning evidence suggests that ragweed, one of those plants that's responsible for producing really allergenic pollen, is getting even more allergenic. It's even more irritating to us than it used to be. And it's spreading too. It's spreading its range further north, and it's just bad news in every direction on this front. We're also seeing impacts to tourism. This is definitely an economic impact to cities that host festivals that are centered around particular biological events. I know where I grew up in the Midwest, we had all sorts of small town festivals. The neighboring town where I grew up had the Howell Melon Festival, which was celebrating the harvest of cantaloupe melons, and there was a melon queen, which I think is really funny, and I hope they don't still have melon queens anymore. But there are worldwide all sorts of festivals and events that celebrate daffodils and lilacs and tulips and all these different events that are shifting in time. And that may not seem like a big deal, but if the city that's hosting an event and drawing in people from all over the place to come and view this spectacle, they typically need to plan the dates for that event. Chambers of Commerce, lock that in and start advertising oftentimes years in advance. If the event ends up not coinciding with the actual biological phenomenon, then it can be a real bust. When I was in college, my parents lived in a town called Holland, Michigan, and that has a huge tulip festival every year. People come in by the bus loads. It's a very big deal. And they have, I don't know, millions of tulip bulbs planted all over the place. People come in for it. And there have definitely been years recently where, because of high winds or early springs or the combination of, by the time the actual event comes, the tulips have lost all their petals, and it's not a very good tulip festival. And the organizers have actually shifted the timing of the event forward recently to try to accommodate the earlier blooming of the tulips. So what role can we play? I know that a lot of you actually are active phenology observers, so I want to thank you so much, because that's one of the very direct ways that we can play a role, getting out there and making observations following standardized protocols, or a consistent way of tracking this can provide extremely valuable information that scientists and managers and decision makers and planners can use And so I'm not going to give you a pitch for Nature's Notebook, though. If you are on this call and you want to learn more, we are more than happy to fill you in. You can start just by downloading the app from either the Google Play Store or iTunes and get started. Really quickly, though, I just wanted to highlight just a couple of the ways that these data are being used. Nature's Notebook has now been in existence for 17 years, and we have over 40 million records that observers all across the country and beyond have contributed. And these data are increasingly valuable for helping us understand how things are changing and how they're expected to continue to change so that we can hopefully prepare ourselves and be positioned to conserve, preserve, and adapt as best as possible going forward. And so one of the ways that these observations are frequently used is simply in understanding how species are responding to rapidly changing conditions. And so how are things changing? You know, kind of along the lines of those examples that I showed earlier with tulip tree and the European adder. These images are taken from a study that was published just earlier this year. And what we're looking at here, it was a global study. They synthesized data both from observational programs like Nature's Notebook, both here in the US and in other countries, as well as from the literature, published assessments. And so the orange dots on here refer to those published literature studies, and the blue dots represent the observational data. And so you can see that there's a lot of blue dots there in California. Those are very likely your observations. And what these folks did was basically try to assess how are things changing. And so these plots here are presenting to you how the timing of activity in plants has shifted just since 1980, when synthesized across all those different studies. And how you read these plots is the trend or the shift is along the x-axis. If something falls at 0, there was no shift. If it's to the left, it means it's gotten earlier, and if it's to the right, it's gotten later. It's a histogram. It's a smooth histogram, meaning among all the species in all the places and all the studies, how much did things shift? And so we can see that largely most of the studies show just a slight shift of just a cup. This would be in days per decade. So this would be just a few days. All the studies that stack up here would be in a few days per decade. The ones way out here shifted by a month earlier. And then the different tones, the darker color means that it was estimate calculated over a longer time period, and if it's a lighter tone, it was a shorter time period. Couple of things to take away here. First of all, the peaks in all of these is on the left side of 0, meaning everything has shifted earlier on average to a greater extent than not. Another thing is that as you progress uphill, I guess, north on the plot, we're moving from the first phases that occur in the spring, bud burst and leaf out, into flowering and then fruit ripening. And largely the magnitude of the shift gets greater as you progress through the season. And so what the authors were arguing here is that the effects of warming are shifting things earlier on average, and that warming is propagated through the season, resulting in later season events expressing a greater shift earlier than those earlier season events, which stands to have consequences, honestly, of all different kinds that I won't go into because we are probably running short on time. But they looked at animals too. And so here are a couple of the same plots for mammals on the top, amphibians here, and then insects. And what you see here is that it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. Raising offspring in mammals probably shows the clearest and greatest shift, but we see a couple of bumps that are to the left of 0 in some of these other plots. Some things have actually shifted the other direction. And so one of the most important take-homes from this is that for interacting animals and plants, we might start to see some serious mismatches. Because it looks like it depends on the species, it depends on the location, but largely we are not seeing everybody shifting at the same rate in the same direction. And so this is kind of like portending changes and mismatches to come probably soon. Another example from California, specifically from Joshua Tree. illustrates how another common way that data are frequently used, which is to better understand the environmental conditions that are necessary for a species to undergo a seasonal transition. A lot of times we know generally, it needs to be warm for things to happen in the spring, but knowing exactly what the conditions are that a particular species has to be exposed to prompt it to flower or leaf out or start to produce fruit is oftentimes not well quantified. Though it is important to understand because as these conditions are changing, we really want to be able to know, like, what are the responses that we might expect to see in different species. Joshua tree, you probably know, is a keystone species. It's really important habitat for a whole lot of plants, or sorry, critters and insects in the Mojave Desert. It's one of the tallest things in the desert, and so owls and raptors use it to get a bird's eye view of the prey that they might try to capture. Woodpeckers peck into the trunk, the soft trunk, and nest in the cavities. Other animals use those cavities once the woodpeckers have moved on, and even branches that fall on the ground are really good habitat for things like snakes and beetles. And it's also just really iconic. And so it's an important species for sure to understand how it might be impacted. And it's considered threatened by the California Endangered Species Act, unfortunately, because have habitat loss and wildfires, and the warmer and drier conditions that we're experiencing in that desert are making it harder for the little tree seedlings to survive and grow up into bigger Joshua trees. So a group of researchers set out to try to figure out what are the conditions that are associated with flowering in this plant? Because flowering is so critical to the production of seeds and therefore the production of the next generation of the trees. And they used Nature's Notebook data in conjunction with some other data to try to model that and figure out not only what are the conditions for flowering, but are they changing? And if they're changing, how are they changing? And what they learned was that flowering is erratic, but it's actually increasing in frequency, which is a good thing. That portends good things for the production of more seeds and maybe baby trees, though those little baby trees they still face a struggle once they germinate, and we need to kind of pray for rain for their survival. But that is an example of where the data are really helpful in just better understanding baseline ecological functioning and how it might change. One more example comes from the whole US, but again, I wanted to feature this one because there are a lot of records from California that were utilized for this one. This is an example, again, of looking at a different kind of influence. These researchers wanted to know how might fall phenology or the leaf color change, the onset of leaf color change, be affected by urbanization. So you've probably heard of the urban heat island effect. More urban areas tend to be warmer earlier in the year and retain their heat longer at the end of the season, as well as stay warmer overnight, because there is so much asphalt and other impervious surfaces that just warm up and then radiate that heat even after the sun has gone down. There's a lot of other effects too, but that's the main effect that definitely has been documented to affect plants and animals in a lot of ways, including phenology. And so these researchers hypothesized, if urban areas are warmer, might we see leaf color change happen later because it's warmer? And so it's basically an extension of the season later. And so what they did was they used over almost 200,000 records of leaf color change in all these different locations that you can see on the map there, in a whole bunch of different deciduous trees. And they basically looked at whether there was a delay in the onset of leaf color change based on urbanization. And so this plot here shows basically urbanization along the x-axis. It's if we're on the left side of the graph, we're in a more rural area, and the further right we go, the greater the population density and the more built up of the environment we're looking at. And on the y-axis, we have the day of year of the start of leaf senescence. And so it's later in the year as you go up. And then what they did was they actually evaluated this by latitude, meaning temperature, because they felt like that might make a difference. And so if we look at the purple line first, that reflects the northernmost parts of the map. It's the coldest locations. And so what we see there is an increasing line such that the least developed areas underwent leaf color change the earliest in the year, and then as it got more developed, we saw leaf color change occurring later and later progressively in the year. That was what they expected to see. But then if we look to the next blue line, which is the next part of the country further south where it's a bit warmer, the slope of that line gets a little shallower, meaning that relationship isn't quite as strong. And that as we continue to move upwards in the average temperature, we actually eventually get to a point where it's a flat relationship, meaning that there is no effect. It doesn't matter whether you're in an urban area or not, leaf color change occurs about the same time. And then the yellow line reflects the southernmost locations or the places with the warmest average temperature. And they actually documented an inverse relationship there where it was so warm already that adding the effect of urbanization actually caused leaf out to occur earlier. So kind of an interesting pattern there. And it's the kind of relationship that we wouldn't be able to evaluate without having data like what we get through Nature's Notebook, which is all across the whole country, all of these different both latitudes and biomes, but also urban and rural and everything in between. There are hundreds of examples now of research studies that have used our data in one way or another. And I'm obviously not going to go through them all now, but they are all captured on our website. And one of the things we do is usually about a bi-monthly basis, draft up what we call a publication summary. We'll take a recent study and then write a brief summary that characterizes that in hopefully what is accessible language so that you can follow this. And so if you're interested in seeing that, they're all captured on our website at this URL. And they also are captured in our newsletters. And so if you don't yet get our newsletters, I strongly encourage you to do that. This is a screen cap from our homepage, usanpn.org. If you scroll to the bottom, you will see this orange arrow that says, get our newsletters. Sign up for those because I promise you it's really good material in there. Not only information on how the data are being used by science and decision making, but also just a lot of other really cool fun tidbits and updates from us and opportunities. So definitely do that. With that, I'll give you a few more opportunities for ways to get connected with us. And I hope I didn't go over in time because I am more than happy to answer questions if you would like.
Alrighty, so before we jump into questions, I'm just going to launch a quick poll. So this should come up on your screen and it's just 4 questions and you just click how much you agree or disagree with each of the statements. And this just helps us with tracking our cones presentations. So I just ask everyone to, fill in their answers and we'll just give like 1 or 2 minutes just to get a kind of big chunk of you answering, and then we'll move on to questions. And if you have any questions after you finish the poll, you can enter them in the chat. And we're going to have Greg Ira, the Environmental Stewards Director. He's going to kick us off with a question just after we get done with this evaluation. But I just want to say, wow, Theresa, that presentation was amazing. I learned so much about the different research studies that use the data that we are all out collecting. I went to college in Washington State, and my friends joked with me that I had berry sonar power because throughout the summer I knew which berries were ripe and where to find them all on my college campus. And so the story about the salmonberry bird slash Swainson's thrush, I was like, oh, this just makes me so happy. because I was that person for all my friends, and I should have I wish I would have listened better so I could have gotten that connection with the Swainson's thrush.
That's awesome. Thanks for
Um,
sharing that.
yeah, so it looks like just about everyone has done the poll. So I'll just end that now. And um, great. So, great. Greg, do you want to kick us off with a question? And then
Yeah,
I'll go to the questions in the chat.
yeah, I just dropped it in the chat and just very quickly, just during your presentation, I was thinking, is there a point at which a seasonal change becomes so erratic, so unstable, so constantly changing that your two options for adaptation and movement really don't even become options anymore? And maybe that's way down the road, but I'm just curious if anyone's kind of really considered that.
Uh-huh. Like a threshold, basically, right?
Yeah.
I I think certainly theoretically, what comes to mind is the oh gosh, what's it called? Like the ball and cup, conceptual diagram of like you can shift a system ever so much and then you get past the point where you can't shift it back. Um, I feel like, yes, theoretically, for sure. I don't know that I can think of right off the top of my head situations that I could cite where we've identified that yet. Um, but I think it's the thing that's on everybody's mind, especially when it comes to mismatch, species that depend upon each other for services and they're very survival, plants and their pollinators is a very obvious one, but there's good examples coming out of the polar regions, especially where things are changing to the greatest degree because warming is happening to the greatest degree up there, where things like caribou are having their young at the time where the plants that they need for the young to eat are no longer optimal for eating. And that's the kind of thing where, if those things spread apart enough, then we could have a total population, you know, plummet. And so, yes, I think it's a concern for sure. It's a threat.
Thank you.
Awesome. So one of the questions in the chat is just looking at wetlands and if there's been any studies specific to phenological changes in wetlands. I mean, obviously, as we're getting these longer, hotter summers, probably wetlands aren't as wet as they used to be.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, that's a good one. Um, I know for certain wetland critters like amphibians are being impacted. Amphibians are one of the ones that seem to be the most sensitive to temperature. I didn't include that particular bit of evidence, but I know that in just a few decades, some frogs have shifted, I think it's spawn time by like 40 to 60 days, some huge, they're just really sensitive. They're so temperature sensitive and moisture sensitive, like you said. They stand to be very vulnerable. Wetland plants, I'm sure somebody has looked at that, but I can't think of a good example. And now I feel like I want to. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to do a good job at answering that one.
That's okay. That's okay. The next question is more focused on if you know of any artists using phenology
Oh,
to enhance the inner life of citizens and deepen connection with the land. Any modern artists who are using
I
phenology.
do. What is that woman's name? I'm gonna have to follow up with you after. I can't think of it right off the top of my head, but there is a woman who is very active in the citizen science field who intersects citizen science and art, and I believe it's about phonology. If you expand it a little more broadly and include writers in that, I could think of a lot of writers also, but definitely one artist comes to mind, and I'm certain that there are many others too. But again, I need more caffeine. I can't remember. Woolery. What's her name? Leanne Woolery. Let me see if I
And
can.
the person says they'd love to hear any writers as well.
Okay. Charmin Apt Russell comes to mind. She's based in New Mexico.
Awesome.
There's another woman that wrote a book called The Spine of the Continent that I can't think of her name, but she talks about citizen science.
There's
Yeah.
a suggestion in the chat. Jane Kim does great nature science art specifically in California. So that's someone else you all can look up. But I do just want to respect everyone's time. I know we could probably stay on for easily another 5 hours and discuss phenology, especially during this exciting phenology time of year. But it is 1:02, so I'm going to stop the recording. And if anyone has any super pressing questions, I'm sure we can stay on for just another moment. But thank you all so much for coming today, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much.
Okay.